a man stands at the prow of a warship with his hand on a bronze valve. And if he turns it the wrong way, he will die before the enemy does. It is the year 678. Below him, the hull rocks against the current of the Bosphorus. Above him, the walls of Constantinople rise into a gray morning, and beyond the walls, smoke already hangs over a city that has been under siege for 4 years. Out on the water, the ships of an Arab fleet sit in a loose blockade, waiting the way an army waits when it believes time is on its side. The crewman does not know their names. He knows only the sound his own ship makes when the pressure inside the tube behind him starts to build. Like something breathing. He has done this before, twice. Both times he lived. He does not let himself think about the third time. Here is the part almost nobody tells you about Greek fire. The mystery was never really the recipe. Historians have spent 1,300 years arguing over the ingredients. Naphtha, pine resin, quicklime, sulfur, in some combination nobody has ever fully proven. But the recipe was only one piece of a machine. Behind that valve sat a pressurized bronze tank. Ahead of it, a nozzle shaped like the mouth of a lion, gilded and terrifying. Beneath the deck, a furnace kept the fuel liquid and ready. And on this ship, and perhaps 30 others like it, a handful of men had been trained to do the one thing that made all of it work. Control the pressure without losing a hand, a face, or a life. This is not a story about a chemical formula. This is a story about a weapons system. Fuel, metal, fire, ships, and men, built to do one specific thing: burn on water. Burn through wood, burn through skin, and keep burning even as the sea tried to put it out. The valve turns. What happens next will save an empire twice. It will also plant the seed of the empire's own forgetting. Because the safest way to keep a weapon secret is to make sure almost no one alive understands the whole of it. And when you build a secret that well, you don't just hide it from your enemies. Eventually, you hide it from yourself. To understand why that valve mattered so much, you have to go back 6 years to a man who arrived in Constantinople with nothing. His name was Kallinikos, and he came from Heliopolis, a city in Syria that had already fallen to Arab conquest a generation earlier. He was an architect, possibly a chemist, almost certainly both, in the way that engineers of the ancient world rarely specialized the way we do now. What we know for certain is this: he was a Christian refugee, fleeing a territory now under Muslim rule, and he arrived at the gates of the Roman Empire's last great capital carrying knowledge instead of possessions. Constantinople, at that moment, needed exactly what he had. The empire was dying by inches. Arab fleets had already crushed Byzantine ships off the coast of Lycia. Raids had reached as far as Sicily, and now, starting around 672, an Umayyad armada under Caliph Muawiyah began tightening a blockade around Constantinople itself, using the peninsula of Cyzicus as a winter base, returning every spring to test the city's walls. Picture that camp through a Mediterranean winter. Cold rain on canvas tents, salted fish running low, men who had expected a quick campaign now counting months instead of weeks. This was not a raid. This was an empire trying to end another empire, and it was prepared to wait as long as it took. Kallinikos brought Constantine IV, something no army on earth had ever fully weaponized before. Fire that ignored the rules fire was supposed to follow. Here's the domain term worth knowing. The device he helped build, or perfect, was called a siphon. From the Greek siphon, a pressurized tube. Think of it as the ancestor of a flamethrower. Centuries before anyone had the word for one. Mounted at the bow of specialized warships called dromons. Fast, oar and sail vessels built for speed and close engagement. The siphon let a crew project a stream of burning liquid at another ship from a safe distance. Not throw it, not drop it, project it under pressure in a controlled arc onto wood, sails, and men, and it worked exactly as advertised. By 678, the effect was already becoming legend. Byzantine dromons emerged from the Golden Horn, bronze tubes at their prows, and sent streams of fire onto the Arab ships blockading the city. Water did nothing. If anything, witnesses claimed, water seemed to make it worse, spreading burning fuel across the surface instead of drowning it. Sailors leapt overboard to escape the flames, only to find the fire followed them into the sea. Clinging to skin the way tar clings to rope, the Arab fleet, after 4 years of siege, broke and withdrew. Byzantine forces pursued the retreat, and what had looked like the empire's final hour instead became one of its most decisive victories. Here's what almost nobody remembers about that victory. It wasn't the fire itself people should have feared. It was what the empire chose to do with it afterward. Constantine IV and his successors treated the entire system, fuel, pressure device, warship design, and trained crew, as something closer to a sacrament than a piece of military technology. Centuries later, Emperor Constantine VII would write that the secret had been revealed by an angel to Constantine the Great himself, with strict instruction: never prepare this fire for anyone but Christians, and only within the walls of the imperial city. Whether or not any emperor believed that literally, the practical effect was the same. The formula, the engineering, the training, all of it stayed locked inside a small circle around the throne, passed down the way a family recipe survives, through people, not documents. And that secrecy held. It held even when the enemy got their hands on the weapon itself. At some point in the following centuries, a Bulgar force captured an actual siphon apparatus along with a supply of its liquid fuel. You would expect that capture to end the mystery. It didn't. The Bulgars had the tank. They had the nozzle. They had the fuel. What they did not have was a single person who understood how the pressure system worked, how much fuel to load, how hot to keep it, or how to release it without killing the men holding it. The weapon sat in their hands, useless, like a locked door, with the key still inside the house it was meant to protect. That is the real strangeness of Greek fire. It wasn't hidden behind a wall. It was hidden behind knowledge. Knowledge so tightly held that even physical possession of the machine meant nothing without the men who'd spent years learning to run it. Which brings us back to the valve. So before we go further, here's the pattern worth holding on to. Greek fire was never one secret. It was 5, stacked on top of each other. A fuel mixture nobody has ever fully reconstructed. A pressurized bronze tank strong enough to hold it. A siphon nozzle precise enough to aim it. A warship built specifically to carry it into battle, and a crew trained quietly, dangerously, over years, to run the entire sequence without dying in the process. Take away any one piece, and the weapon doesn't work. That's why capturing a siphon meant nothing to the Bulgars. That's why the Arab fleet, even after watching it in action for years, could never build their own version that matched it. The secret wasn't a formula written on a scroll somewhere, waiting to be stolen. It was a living system, held together by people who rarely wrote any of it down. If you're finding this as strange as I do, stay with the video, because the Empire didn't just protect this secret once. They kept protecting it, generation after generation, even as the cost of that protection quietly started to add up. Quick favor before we continue. If stories like this are the kind of history you want more of, hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. Now, watch what happens the second time the Empire's survival comes down to this weapon. By 717, the Arabs came back, and this time they came prepared for everything except the one thing that still couldn't be copied. The Second Great Siege of Constantinople was, in almost every way, more dangerous than the first. The Umayyad Caliphate had grown stronger. Their fleet was larger. Their siege lasted through a brutal winter. And the Byzantines inside the walls were, by most accounts, hungry, exhausted, and running low on the confidence that had carried them through the last war. Emperor Leo III held the city together through fortifications, deception, and careful negotiation. But it was the Byzantine navy, still armed with Greek fire, still built around dromons and siphons, that broke the Arab blockade at sea. Again and again, until the siege collapsed under its own weight. 2 sieges, 2 Arab fleets, 2 decisive naval defeats, both driven by the same weapon. By this point, you'd think the secret would have leaked. 50 years had passed since Kallinikos first arrived as a refugee. Empires talk. Soldiers gossip. Prisoners are interrogated. There were, over the centuries, rumors of rival powers trying to buy the formula outright or bribe a defector who actually understood it. None of it worked. Either the offers never reached anyone who knew the full sequence, or the men who did know it valued something, loyalty, faith, fear of the emperor, more than any price on offer. And still, after all of that, no rival power ever produced a working equivalent. Here's the part that explains why. The empire didn't just guard the formula. It built religion around it. Roughly 2 centuries later, Emperor Constantine VII sat down to write instructions for his own son, a kind of imperial handbook called De Administrando Imperio, on the governance of the empire. In it, he devoted real space to Greek fire. And what he wrote wasn't engineering advice. It was myth. He claimed the fire had been revealed by an angel to Constantine the Great, the empire's founding emperor, with a binding condition attached. Prepare this fire only for Christians, and only within the walls of this city, never elsewhere, never for anyone else. Think about what that story actually does. It's not really about angels. It's a security policy dressed up as scripture, a reason so absolute, so tied to divine command that no future emperor could quietly loosen it, sell it, or let it slip to a foreign ally for the right price. Fear of God did what fear of enemies alone might not have. And the system kept evolving, even inside that secrecy. Look at what Emperor Alexios I did with it generations later. According to the historian and princess Anna Komnene, Alexios feared the naval skill of the Pisan fleet he was about to face. So he had his engineers mount gilded bronze and iron heads onto the prows of his ships, lions, and other fearsome beasts, jaws open, polished until they gleamed. The fire tubes were run directly through the open mouths of these creatures. When the siphons fired, it looked, to the men on the receiving end, as though the lions themselves were vomiting flame across the water. That's not just engineering. That's theater, built by people who understood psychological warfare as well as chemistry. But notice something underneath all of this. Every safeguard the empire added, the myth, the family secrecy, the tiny circle of trained crews, did the same thing twice. It protected the weapon from outsiders, and it made the weapon depend more and more heavily on a small, closed, and shrinking group of people who actually understood how to run it. A system that only a handful of men can operate is powerful right up until the moment those men are gone. Now go back to the man with his hand on the valve. By the time we reach the later centuries of the empire, through the chaos of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and finally to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, something had quietly changed. Gunpowder had arrived. Cannons were reshaping naval and siege warfare across the Mediterranean. And Greek fire, the weapon that had twice saved an empire from annihilation, no longer decided the outcome of a siege. It's likely the records here are thin, and historians still argue about exactly when the practice faded, that by the empire's final centuries, the compartmentalized knowledge network that once sustained the weapon had simply thinned with time. Fewer masters, fewer apprentices, fewer ships built specifically around it. That valve, in 678, controlled more than pressure. It controlled a sequence of decisions almost nobody else on that ship fully understood. How much fuel to load into the tank below deck? How long to let the furnace bring it to the right heat? How far to open the valve before igniting the stream, and how to shut it all down again without a spray of burning liquid catching the wind and turning back on the crew itself. Historians estimate that only a small number of specialists in any given generation were ever trusted with the complete sequence, not because the empire didn't trust its own soldiers, but because every additional person who understood the whole system was one more way for the whole system to walk out the door. This is not a story about a chemical formula lost to time. This is not a story about a weapon that simply stopped working. This is a story about what happens when the safest way to protect something also becomes the surest way to lose it. There's a version of this same logic still running today. Modern nuclear weapons programs are built on a similar architecture, deliberately compartmentalized, so that no single scientist, technician, or engineer holds the complete picture of how a weapon actually functions from first principle to final trigger. It works. It keeps secrets remarkably well, but it carries the same quiet cost the Byzantines discovered the hard way. If the institution holding all those separated pieces together ever collapses, through war, through neglect, through simply running out of people who were taught in time, the knowledge doesn't get stolen. It doesn't get sold. It just stops existing, piece by piece, the same way it was built. Somewhere in the final years of the empire, a crewman stood at a prow for what turned out to be the last time anyone in his line would ever do it. He didn't know that. There was no ceremony, no record made. He turned the valve. The fire went out across the water the way it always had, and the ship sailed on. It's the records themselves that go quiet after this, not a dramatic ending. Just fewer and fewer mentions, until the great fleets built around the weapon simply aren't built that way anymore. The empire didn't lose Greek fire in a single moment. It lost it the way you lose anything you were too careful to write down. So here's what actually stayed with me, working through this one. First, the truth of it. Greek fire wasn't a mystery ingredient. It was a complete weapon system, fuel, pressurized bronze engineering, purpose-built warships, and a small trained corps of specialists held together for over 4 centuries. Not through any single unbreakable formula, but through people who pass the whole picture down mouth to mouth, hand to hand. Second, what it means for you. The instinct to protect something valuable by locking it away, by telling as few people as possible, feels safe. It usually is safe, for a while. But knowledge that lives in only a handful of heads is knowledge that's one bad year, one lost generation, one collapsed institution away from disappearing completely. And that's true of empires. And it's just as true of a family business, a piece of software, or a skill nobody ever wrote a manual for. Third, and this is the part that actually stays with me. Somewhere in Constantinople's final centuries, a crewman stood at a prow, turned a valve he'd trained years to understand, watched the fire spread across the water, one more time, and went home. Nobody in that moment knew it might be one of the last times anyone alive would do it right. There was no final ceremony for Greek fire, no last demonstration, just a slow silence in the records. Until one day, the fire that once burned across the water for 400 years simply wasn't there anymore. So tell me, of everything humanity has built and then lost, which vanished piece of ancient technology would you most want rediscovered? Tell me below.